So something I love working with inside of TouchDesigner that's really easy to get started with is actually making really complex geometric patterns. So you won't believe how easy this is. The first thing we're going to start off is just a basic example of instancing circles around another circle. Now that sounds really simple. It's going to be simple, but the result is actually really cool. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by making a circle SOP. And then I'm going to right click on the output here, go to Comp and select Geometry. And this basically gives us the basis of how we can render this later. And we're not going to go too deep into rendering today. We're going to focus mostly on the geometry. But this now allows me to go and split my pane here. And then I can set my second pane using this top left pane type to be a geometry viewer. And I'll go ahead and make that a little bit smaller, and that'll just be a nice way that we can view whatever we're working with. Now, one thing to know is that whenever we click on our geometry, it's going to go fully green for a little bit, and all you have to do is just click onto the background or another operator to make it so that we can see what's actually going on here. So I'll go ahead and apply a line material to my geometry. Line is very useful if you want to do wireframe type of work. I find it's basically like a wireframe, but can do a lot more interesting things than just wireframing. So now starts to come a little bit of the interest. So we have this circle, and what you'll find a lot of the times in geometric design and generative design and algorithmic design is you take a simple idea and you just keep doing it more and more until it becomes this really complex and rich pattern that's kind of looks quasi-mathematical. So a good example of this is I have this circle. I'm going to make another one here, and I'm going to put a null after it. And I'm going to instance my first circle against the second circle. So I'll go to my geometry, go to the instance page, turn on instancing, and then where I have my translate op here, I'll grab my SOP, and then I'll assign my P0 as my TX, P1 as my TY, and P2 as my TZ. Now by default, you're just going to see this green until you click off, and lo and behold, we've already started to make what looks like this really intricate pattern. And a lot of clients or a lot of other people might think, wow, they spent so much time on this. Literally, we just took one circle and at every single point in that circle, put another circle. Now, how you start to play with this is really where it becomes a lot of fun to have it be generative and real time. So for example, one whole direction of this creation process could go down the road of, manipulating in real time your instance base. So for example, I could right click on this wire, insert operator, put a transform SOP, and you'll see even by doing simple things like rotating this, I can make really interesting dynamic shapes here and that move smoothly through each other. Let's try with the Y. Now the cool thing here is a lot of the optical illusions you're going to get when you start working with these patterns, because this looks like a torus, but actually you'll see if we look at it from the side, it's actually just circles instanced in that shape. And you could even start doing really interesting camera work to move around these, and you can see that the different view that you take really changes what elements come to the forefront. Beautiful patterns in the middle here. So there's a lot of really fun stuff that you can do with this. And we're going to look at a few of those different things. But you can see even something as simple as applying some rotation. And I'm going to home my viewer here so I'm looking at it head on. Even something as simple as this. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit of this automation process. Because what I can do is, instead of just manually rotating this, I can use the abs time, which is Python for the absolute time since the project has started, .seconds, which essentially gives me a seconds counter since the project has started. And now we can just let this run in the background and let it do its slow rotation as we start to compound the effects on top of this. Because this is really interesting because we're dealing with instancing. And don't mind the green. Again, when we click away from it, we'll see our pattern here. But since we're dealing with instancing, we can adjust different parameters and attributes of every individual circle inside of this, which adds a whole other layer of interest and design and complexity to this. So a really simple one that I like to work with is scaling. So I can have all of the different circles take on a different scale parameter. So, some interesting ways we could start with this is, let's say, just to start, I want to start with some noise. So I'll go ahead and make a noise chop. And as you do with instancing, you always have to make sure the lengths of all of your different instancing sources match. And by length, what I mean is, for example, if we middle click on this null, we have 40 points. That means any of our chops also need to have 40 samples. And you can see by default, my noise is at 300 samples right now. So I'm just going to go over to the channel. And what I'm going to do is, first, I'll go ahead and just rename this to be channel name scale. And I want to change the start and end values so that I have exactly 40 samples, one for every single point. So the easy way to do this is just on the end, I'm going to change the units here, which is by default seconds, to be samples. And you can see when I do that, we get from 0 to 299, which is exactly what you see here. And that is 300 samples, because remember, including 0. So if I wanted to have 40, I could simply do 0 to 39. And if I middle click, you'll see now I have 40i. And then let's go ahead and just straight up put a null chop after this. And even before we get to play with the noise, let's just assign this as our scale values and see. So I'll take my chop here, drag and drop it on my scale op, and then I'll assign the scale as my X, Y, and Z scaling. And I can click off, and already it's creating some pretty interesting, artistic shapes. One thing I'm going to do also is scale this noise, because by default it's going to have a range of 1 down to -1. And for scaling purposes, we probably only need 0 to 1, or even maybe 0.2, because maybe we don't want the circles to completely disappear. So I can go ahead and right click, insert operator, put a math chop in here, go to my range. And I know that, like I mentioned, all noise by default is going to be from -1 to 1. And then here, you can even start doing interesting things like playing with these scales and creating these really beautiful geometric patterns of, based on such and such number, I can make these bigger or smaller. The different overlaps create some cool patterns. But I'll leave this at something simple, maybe 0.5 to... yeah, like 1.25 should be all right. Now we can even keep compounding just these simple things we're doing. So for example, I can start to animate this noise a little bit. So, what you could do is play with the different periods, and you can see doing that does some crazy things where a lower period makes it look more fragmented and higher period kind of brings it back into like a whole. You could play with things like roughness, exponents. But even before we play with any of those, what we can do is actually move the noise itself under the transform parameters. And this is something I like doing a lot when I want to have some really simple animated noise. I can go to something like the translate Z and actually just start moving that parameter. And what you can see is that gives a really natural and flowing kind of movement to the noise that can be affecting whatever I'm trying to impact and change. Now, similarly, again, this is going to be kind of a recurring thing that I do a lot that you'll see is I'll go ahead and click on the translate so I can see the parameter a little bit better. And I'll write abs time dot, maybe we'll go seconds and see how that looks. So it's doing some interesting stuff, but maybe I want to speed this up. And if you're ever working with these kind of Python expressions, a good trick to know is that if you multiply it by a number greater than 1, it's going to speed up the counter. And if you multiply it by a number that's smaller than 1, you're essentially going to slow down the counter. So for example, if I did multiplied 0.1, this would actually start to move so much slower, 1/10 of the speed. And on the flip side, if I multiply this by 10, it's going to be moving 10 times as fast as it was before. Now that might be a little bit much, so maybe I'll go ahead and just do something like 3. And you can already see it's really got some mesmerizing patterns that are being created here. And this is still really just this simple idea of circle being instanced on the points of another circle. And we'll kind of start playing with that paradigm in a moment here. But these control channels, especially once we're starting to deal with instancing, and this is just scale. Once you start doing it into individual rotations per piece, or even coming and doing separate RGB colors per instance. There's a lot of really interesting stuff you can do. So just to give you another example of a cool type of channel that I like to use for controlling this type of content is a pattern chop. And if you've never used the pattern chop before, it's very similar to a wave chop, and it's a chop you use to generate some common, signal types like sine waves, triangles, ramps, square waves. And the nice thing about it is how easy it is to control inside of these settings. So for example, I know that I need this to be 40 samples long. Right now it's at 1,000. So I have this length parameter. Go ahead and set that to 40. And then what I'm going to do is drag the output wire of my pattern chop and actually drop it on top of the wire that's already connected here. You'll see it highlights yellow. And that's a cool little trick that allows you to just replace an existing wire that you have. Now we're going to see a little warning flag here. That's because by default, this is named Chan1. So actually I should just rename inside of my pattern chop this to be scale. And already you can see this gives a cool effect where, this is the lowest part of our pattern here, our sine wave. It's kind of in the middle. And then going across both ways, it goes up to 0 and -1. So I can start to play with this a little bit. For example, what I can do is maybe impact this phase and put some kind of dynamic value on this and have this kind of do this little effect. So, once again, even something simple as abs time. And in this case, I'll actually use maybe .frame. Now the interesting thing is the abs time.frame is moving so quickly through the phase that we actually don't see any change. So this is where, again, that trick comes in handy. Let's multiply this by a smaller number. And that's still too big, so maybe 0.01. And you can see we start to get these really mesmerizing, interesting patterns. Now we'll come back to the channel control in a little bit, but what's really interesting is once you start thinking about this concept of, instancing some object on another object, you can start swapping out those objects and creating even more complex patterns. So for example, something I like to do is test with different, geometry here. So instead of instancing a circle, maybe we can instance a rectangle. So let's go ahead and plug this rectangle into my geometry instead of the circle. And you'll see this is interesting, but maybe not as interesting as the circle itself. And something I find, especially with geometric design and these kind of more generative geometric designs, a lot of the beauty and magic comes when things start to overlap. So in this case, I'm actually just going to make my rectangle size much greater. So 2.5 by 2.5. And now you can see there's a lot more interesting things happening inside of here when the lines of each one of the rectangles start to overlap. We almost get a three-dimensional effect here, but remember, this is completely flat. There's nothing 3D about this, but just the way that things are overlapping kind of gives us this like plane vibe going on inside of it. Now you don't even have to stop at just 2D content, right? So for example, I could actually take a box and take this full 3D box and instance it at each point inside of my circle. Now I'm going to do the same thing again here where just by default I find the size a little bit too small, so I'm going to go ahead and increase the box size. And then you can already see this is creating some really interesting perspectives, some different looks. You can look at it from different angles and get different effects going on in here. And this is where the line material starts to come really in handy because it has a nice feature where it lets you define the width of the line based on how far away from the camera it is. So for example, by default here, we have the lines closer to the camera are going to be bigger. So I can maybe even accentuate that a little bit and then make the lines farther away from the camera even smaller. And now we're really starting to get this three-dimensional, aesthetic where these grids in front of us are nice and thick, but as you move into it, they kind of get darker and a little bit thinner. You could even flip that on its head a little bit and put all of the closer lines to being thin lines and the farther away lines start to become really thick. Now this doesn't have to stop with just what we're instancing. So for example, let's just put back our circle here. And instead of using a circle as the base of our instancing positions, we can actually transition this to something 3D. So maybe actually we can use a sphere. Now let me plug in the sphere to my transform, and you're going to get this error, and it's going to say a bunch of stuff, but essentially this goes back to the same length that I mentioned previously. So in this case, when I middle click here, we'll see that by default my sphere has 722 points, but these are all set to have 40 points. So a good trick that I like to use here is if I have these kind of setups with instancing where, you know, maybe my source geometry is changing point size, I can use a really handy Python expression inside of my different chops to just look up the number of points available inside of the geometry and then update dynamically. So in this case, instead of my length being 40, what I can do is start an op call, and then where it wants the name, I can say null1, and then I can put dot num points with a capital P. So that way, no matter how I change the sphere, whatever geometry I plug in here, my pattern is dynamically going to change in size to match that correctly. And you can already see here, we got something way more complex, way more interesting happening. Almost looks like some kind of fossilized structure. And maybe I'll actually turn down the width on my line here a little bit. You know, you can adjust those. You can pepper it to flavor, but you can see there's some really interesting kind of meshes being created, some cool patterns, looking at it from different angles. And this really is just simply a circle being instanced 722 times across the surface of a sphere. And then remember, we're still doing things like a really simple rotation on the origin. And then just right now, we're even just doing something as simple as moving a sine wave to use for the scale values of those instances. And this is really where your creativity comes into play, because maybe, you know, we start doing other types of rotation on top of that. So I just took that abs time.seconds and also put it to rotate the sphere on the x-axis. And you can see already that's also adding this very interesting kind of movement through, almost like a vortex look to it. I'll go ahead and delete that for now. You can also go back and maybe instead of using just a simple sine wave, we want to use some noise. So I'll go ahead and plug my noise back in, and like I said, you can just take the output of the noise and highlight the wire of the pattern to overwrite it. Now in this case, we do have to update the amount of samples in our noise. So I'll go over to channel, and I can do a very similar thing like I did before. I can do, and actually I'll drop this down so it's easier to see, op null1 dot num samples. Now the one different thing about this one is that because we have to include index number 0, we actually have to put a -1 on this. Oh, and we got a, oh, not num samples, excuse me, num points. Because if we didn't have this -1, what we would see, actually, let's show it off here, is we'd have 723 because we have 722 is the value we get from the number of points, but also this starts its index at 0. So we'll just add a -1 here. And you can already see this is creating some really beautiful, natural, organic looking shapes, patterns, structures in there. And then this even extends to, you know, now we can plug the rectangles back in and see. You know, we can even move over and have our boxes instanced based on the sphere. And that creates almost, you know, it reminds me of Interstellar in the Tesseract. You know, a lot of these effects really are not super complicated maths. They're just a combination of a few simple things that you compound over and over again to create these really interesting abstract patterns. So with that, I hope this leaves you in a cool place where you feel excited to experiment a little bit with instancing. Like I said, we just use simple, you know, one channel for all our XYZ scales. You can put different channels here. You can make a separate set of chops that control your rotation of every instance. You can go and give each one a different color of RGB values. You can use more interesting kinds of geometry here. So we experimented with a circle and a sphere. You could easily use things like a torus. You could even import your own models and connect those up. Any of those kind of things that you want to do, Like even that, just switching it from a sphere to a torus creates a different but also kind of compelling, interesting shape. Playing with camera angles, playing with the line mat. It's really just a few simple tools that give us a lot of power to create beautiful content inside of TouchDesigner. Enjoy. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you're serious about learning TouchDesigner and getting into our interactive and immersive industry, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner interactive professionals. You can click the link in the description to learn more about that. And if you liked this video, hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and click on the little bell icon for more awesome free content.